Hello, everyone. Welcome to Canadian music in the 80s and 90s and more. If you like what you see, please subscribe and say you like it. This is someone I've talked to before, Charlie Rhindress, but we talked on my Stomp and Tom fan club. This is his first time on Canadian music in the 80s and 90s and more. Welcome.
Oh, thank you so much, Alan. Thanks for having me. Nice to see you again.
And for sure, last time I talked to you, you had a book out about Stomp and Tom, and you've
Yeah.
written a book about Rita MacNeil, which I recommend people pick up. But we're here to talk about this that just came out. You've been at this for a while. How long have you been at this?
This book took me longer than any of the others. It took 4 years from beginning to end. Um, in part, I think when I started writing it, I thought well, I knew I would be writing shorter chapters. The biographies of Rita and Tom, of course, were like 80 to 90,000 words because it's a full book. So I thought that this would be a lot less work, but I realized that I have a hard time writing unless I kind of completely understand them. So I did the same amount of research that I
Right.
would have done for a regular book. I just couldn't write as much, and I did write a lot and ended up cutting it. So it took me a while.
Yeah, and so how many years were you working on this? You've been working on it for a while because I remember talking to you before,
Yeah,
like even during the Stomp and Tom promoting that book, I think you were working on it then.
exactly. Yeah, Tom came out. The Stomp and Tom book came out in the fall of 2019, and we were going to go on the road to Ontario on a book tour in the spring slash summer of 2020, and COVID hit. So we had to
Right.
change all our plans, and I started doing a lot of stuff online, and you were one of the things I did. But during that time, my publisher came to me and said, "Okay, what do you want the next book to be?" And we decided on this one. And I thought, "Oh, with COVID, I'm going to have all kinds of time sitting around the house with nothing to do. I'll have this one written in 6 months." That's not the way it worked. And I think most people, that was their COVID experience. I remember there was a meme going around about someone saying, all those things I thought I'd get done if I had just had the time, turns out I just wasn't going to do them. So
That's one way to put it for sure.
yeah. So yeah, it was 4 years. I started it in June of 2020 is when I wrote my first notes. It was a chapter on Anne Murray. I started doing some research.
And you've had connections with some of the artists on here, like Carroll Baker.
Yeah, I got to know Carol because of this book. So
Okay.
I'm when I wrote the going back in time, I wrote a play based on the life of Rita MacNeil, and it was published in 2000. So
Right.
I actually reached out to Rita's son, and he arranged for me to meet Rita, and she actually worked on the play with me, and I would write a draft and I'd send it to her, and she'd give me notes. She called me to the tea room at one point in time, and we sat down, we went through the scripts, every single page, and she'd go, "Oh dear, yes, no, my father never would have talked like that, and my husband wouldn't have said that." And she fixed stuff for me, and she came to rehearsals, so I got to know Rita. So years later, Formac, my publisher, wanted a book about Rita MacNeil, and they knew I'd written the play and I'd worked with her, so they
Right.
approached me, and that's how I ended up writing my very first book. So I knew Rita because of that. But Rita's manager at the time, or sort of promoter, was a man named Brian Edwards out of
Right.
Ontario. And I
Hmm.
interviewed him and we stayed in touch. And then I knew he was friends with Carroll Baker because he would comment on her stuff all the time. So I reached out to Brian and said, "Do you think there's any chance Carroll Baker would talk to me?" And he said, "Well, here, try her on this Facebook." He told me which Facebook to approach her on. And I used his name and I wrote to her and she said, "Sure." And we chatted for 2 hours that first time. We've been friends ever since. She added me on Facebook, and I brought her to Amherst to do a tour when she was on tour, sorry, to do a concert. And yeah, she comments on my Facebook stuff. Yeah, she's a sweetheart, really lovely person.
Yeah, she strikes me as one of the nicer people in the industry. Like, period. I imagine Rita was too when you got to know her a little bit too.
Yeah, Rita was a sweetheart. Rita was so kind, but Rita was so quiet. Like I had loved Rita's music since the late 1980s, and I'd wanted to write a play about her. The first time I
Right.
heard her music, I thought the songs, I heard her old feminist stuff, which people weren't as familiar with. And I thought, this doesn't fit with the image that I had of Rita MacNeil, all these protest songs. So I became fascinated by the two Rita MacNeils and wanted to
Right.
write a play because I worked in theater. So forever I wanted to write a play about Rita, and I felt like I really connected with her music. But then I remember one day we were holding auditions. The show was done. I first did it at my theater company in Sackville, New Brunswick, Live Bait Theater. And then Neptune Theater did it in Halifax, and Rita had approval over the cast. So we were sitting in the rehearsal hall one day and auditioning people to play Rita MacNeil. And I'm there alone with Rita, and the actor leaves, and there's nobody else there. It's just the two of us. And I was like, I'm finally alone hanging out with Rita MacNeil, and I don't know what to say because she was so quiet. She wouldn't, you couldn't get a conversation going. And she was a sweet, sweet person, like so kind, but also so incredibly shy. It was hard to get a conversation going. Carroll Baker, not so much. She's a chatterbox and she's a sweetheart.
And then you hear Rita sing, and she just, it's
Oh,
amazing.
and that's the thing about Rita is, this is what I got to in the biography. I don't even know if I captured it as well in the play, but certainly by the time I wrote the book, and there is a chapter about her in the new book because I couldn't write a book about singers, female singers from Nova Scotia and not include Rita. But the idea that Rita sang her emotions was very strong. She couldn't talk them, but she could sing them. And one of my favorite stories, Brooks Diamond, who was Rita's manager for years,
Mhm.
told me this story that one time Rita and her husband were divorced, but they still did things together with their kids.
Right.
And Rita and her husband David and their son Wade went on a tour of the colliery mines in Sydney. And so she went down into the pit, and there was a miner who told all the stories about the miners who died in the pit. And he was suffering from throat cancer, and Rita's mom had died from throat cancer a few years before. And it struck her really hard, and she started to cry, and she couldn't stop crying. And by the time they got in the car, she got in the back seat and was just bawling her head off. And Wade said to his father, "Daddy, what's wrong with Mummy?" And he said, "She's writing a song." And the song she wrote was Working Man. And I love that story that when she had big emotions like that, people who were close to her knew that that emotion would come out in the form of a song.
And that's probably her signature song of, her later career, I would think.
Definitely, yeah. The Nova Scotia writer Silver Donald Cameron wrote liner notes for a Rita CD called Night at the Orpheum, and he wrote in there, I think it was in there, he wrote that Working Man was the song Rita was born to write. So anyway, but yeah, no, she was a sweetheart. And but in terms of knowing those, so I know those two ladies, but I also got to know Anne Murray because
Right.
I volunteered to do some work with the Anne Murray Center in 2017. And over the years, I've done more and more. And then this past year, I helped her. She had a bunch of unreleased music that was in the archives at the University of Calgary. EMI
Okay.
Music had donated all their stuff to the University of Calgary, so I was helping Anne track that down. And yeah, I've been working on that with her for the last few months, and we found over 50 songs that Anne recorded that were never
Wow.
released. So, and there may be
That's
some news about those soon. That's all I'll say.
I was gonna say that's not gonna ever see the light of day. It'd be great if it did.
Yeah, I'm very hopeful.
And she's pretty much retired now, though, isn't she?
Yeah, she retired in 2008 and was kind of done with music. And I think she was kind of surprised when we started because what we were going to do was the songs, people that were supporters of the Anne Murray Center. She thought she'd just do a little private listening party because you can't really do
Right.
anything with the songs legally. So she just thought she'd do a little listening party. And anyway, when I started sending them to her, I think she was surprised at the quality of some of the songs. And so now I think they're gonna maybe, they have to go through, you have to jump through a bunch of hoops to,
Right.
get the rights and all that kind of stuff now. But I do think that, it's possible something might happen with them. And Anne's been retired for 16 years. So
Were these like recorded finished songs, or were they just like demos?
yeah, no, they were mostly finished. And it turned
Really?
out that in many cases they had anywhere from 16 to 32 tracks, and they would have there was a guitar track. And for me, as I'm an Anne Murray fan, so getting to listen to
Right.
these songs that Anne hasn't even heard in 40 years, and then I send it off to her and she's writing back to me. It was pretty amazing. But also, in some cases, I had just the vocal track. There were some that were just a couple rough mixes, but
Right.
most of them had like I say, 16 to 32 channels, but some would be just the vocal track. And I'm listening to just Anne Murray's naked voice, and she's such a great singer. So,
Oh, for sure. She always had that.
yeah.
So that must have made it a little easier to know the people you were writing about and some, but there were some you didn't know. Was that more difficult?
Yeah, in some ways it is because you want to, when I write my biographies, I want to present the people. I don't want it to just be the same thing you would read in, a profile in a magazine.
Right.
I kind of want to get a little deeper and hopefully make you think about the people in a different way. And I got really lucky with Rita MacNeil and Stompin' Tom because I think both of them, there was a lot more to them than their public image. And I find it
Right.
frustrating because I wrote the book about Stompin' Tom in 2019, and you as a Stompin' Tom fan, I assume you'll be able to relate to this, but the vast majority of his fans just think, oh, he who he was on stage, that's who he really was. And it's like, no, that was a
No,
character he was playing, and there was
it
so much
was, yeah.
more to the man. And people just don't even want to believe that. They don't want to hear that he read philosophy and that he, was really smart, and that was an image he created of the down-to-earth guy. So he'd appeal to the most people. And there's just so much more to Tom than people seem to realize or even want to know about. So, and same with Rita. So to answer your question, with people like Holly Cole and Sarah McLachlan, when I had to rely mostly on interviews and the stuff that was in the media, it's a little harder to come up with new stuff. Like, because if I can interview someone who knows them, usually I can start to get a peek inside to who they really are.
No, you said I don't want to give away all of your book, but
Mhm.
I haven't read all of it yet either. I've read quite a bit of it, but you said in your book there were so many people you could have had in your book, but you weren't sure about, the strong connections to Nova Scotia, really, or but I mean, Sarah McLachlan obviously hasn't lived in Nova Scotia for a long time, or does she still have connections there? Like, is there
Her
still
family, no, her family has mostly passed away that lived in Nova Scotia or moved away.
okay?
But I saw an interview with her just the other day on CTV, and she was saying that she still thinks of it as home, and she still feels that strong connection, and she's excited to come back and do when she does her tour here. And I know that when we were in the midst of COVID and there was the mass murder, she and her daughter sang Angel and sent it out to she said, my fellow Nova Scotians. And I think one of the things I find interesting about Sarah is just anecdotally, before I had done any research, I heard a number of people say, "Oh, Sarah McLachlan, she hates Nova Scotia. She lives in Vancouver. She doesn't even admit she's from here." And
Yeah,
that's not the case at all. The more
yeah,
research I did, from the very beginning, she has always talked about Halifax as home. She serves on the Fountain Center of the Performing Arts at Dalhousie University. They have
okay,
that new center. She's on the board of that. Like I said, she did that special tribute to Nova Scotia during the mass murders. And she's always been. I think she had a rough childhood in Nova Scotia, and
mhm,
certainly her life is in Vancouver now. But I think she continues to feel a connection with this place. Like Carroll Baker. Carroll Baker also left when she was 15,
right,
but Carol still has family in Nova Scotia, and she bought a church down there, and
yeah.
yeah.
And Anne Murray's moved back to Nova Scotia too, from what I've heard.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, Anne lives here now. She moved back. I think it was the year before COVID. I think it was 2019. She
Right.
has a home in Halifax now. And when I've talked to Carol Baker about it, Carol has said, she feels like she said, Anne's so lucky that Anne was able to move home. But
Yeah,
Carol has a daughter and grandchildren and stuff in Ontario now, and that's where
sure.
her life has been. So she's going to stay there. But yeah, she's a little envious of Anne for moving back here.
And what about Holly Cole? Is she in Toronto or in Ontario, or does she still have connections in Nova Scotia too?
She still has connections here as well. Now, uh, maybe 3 years ago, she had bought a property on the south shore of Nova Scotia. And up until about a year ago, you could actually rent it out as an Airbnb. And then I went
Oh,
looking in the last few months and it's not listed anymore. And I don't know if she sold it but I believe she was living in Toronto, continued to live in Toronto, but still had parents here and came back and did own a property here until just, I think if she sold it, it's within the last year or so.
and one more thing I do want to give away from the book, which I found fascinating in the first part of the book, where you wrote about that stretch where the female Juno winners were pretty much Nova Scotia from
Yeah.
Nova Scotia. Like I don't remember. I'm trying to remember from like 19 when the Juno started up
Yeah.
until almost the 90s.
Yeah.
All the country female vocalists were from Nova Scotia.
Yeah, the period I talk about is 74 to 91, but the Junos started in 71 and Anne won
Right.
that year too. So I probably could have gone back a little further. But yeah, I think from 1974 to 1991, there were only 3 years that it wasn't someone from Nova Scotia that won Country Female Vocalist of the Year at the Juno Awards. And Carroll Baker and Anne Murray both won them a lot, and Rita won. But also they won in the pop category, not quite as much. And I can't remember the statistic because I wrote it probably a year ago. They won quite a bit because Anne and Rita both had that crossover success, and even Sarah McLachlan, who at one time was thought of as kind of alternative, she ended up on the pop charts as well. So
Right.
between Sarah, Rita, and Anne, they also won a number of the Pop Juno Awards.
That's for sure. Yeah, for sure. Like Sarah probably continued that, and then of course got her name out there with the Lilith Fair tour. which
Yes.
I think broke her internationally when she, because that was a groundbreaking tour at the time. That was unheard of
Yeah.
when she started it. So I think that broke her very big internationally anyway.
The fact that you use the word groundbreaking, I love because I did start with about 18 women, and there are certainly probably even more than that, really
Right.
impressive women from Nova Scotia that I could have written about. But the six that I ended up with, and the reason I ended up with a lot less was because I interviewed Carroll Baker, I interviewed her band leader, I interviewed a friend of hers, and I did tons of research. And I was supposed to have a 6,000 word chapter, and the first chapter I turned in, I think, was 18,000 words or something like that. And my publisher was like, okay, well, keep going, but try to write less for the next one. And then Anne Murray was supposed to be like, I don't know. I think by then we'd agreed it was going to be 8 to 10,000 words, and it was 37,000 words. So I was just overwriting because I just found their stories fascinating. Anyway, so what I was going to say is the ones that we ended up with, the six that we ended up with, it was kind of a fluke, but every one of them had a groundbreaking career. They weren't just successful. Each
Right.
one of them broke new ground in a different way.
Yeah.
So I found that kind of interesting, and that was by accident. That wasn't. I didn't go, who's out there that's a trailblazer. It's just the six that I ended up with. It turned out that because at first I thought it could be women who were either born in Nova Scotia or based their careers here, because there are
Okay.
certainly women who have chosen to make Nova Scotia their home. But in the end, it's six women who were born in Nova Scotia, and they all achieved their success before the advent of the internet, which I find interesting because now you can sit, like you and I, we're in different
Yeah.
parts. You're in PEI, right? And I'm
Yeah.
in Amherst, Nova Scotia, and we're sitting here chatting. And I could put out a song tonight, and it could go out to the world from Amherst. Well, when
Right.
their careers were getting going, that wasn't the case. You couldn't write a
True.
song in Big Pond and share it with the world immediately. So
Yeah, I guess you don't think about that. The technology has changed so much since they were broke ground
yeah,
where they were. And I don't know if you'll ever see anything like that again, really, because of the
no,
way the like you said, you could do a song tonight and have it
yeah.
out to the world in an hour,
Yeah,
you know?
exactly.
Yeah,
So I don't think that being from Nova Scotia limits you in any way. Whereas I do think at one time it did. If you wanted a career here,
right.
like Anne Murray didn't want to move to Toronto, but she
Yeah,
did, and she was even pressured to move to LA. She resisted that, but
sure.
she didn't even want to go as far as Toronto. So, but she had to in the 70s.
And Sarah going to Vancouver because there was a vibrant music scene there that probably
Exactly.
helped her break out the way she wanted to as well. Now,
Yeah.
Sarah's going on the anniversary tour of Fumbling Towards Ecstasy, which was that her? What you think that was her breakout internationally, or was it Solace? You think?
I, I think it was probably Fumbling Towards Ecstasy. I think that was
Yeah,
sort of the one that broke her. And it kind of happened right around the same time as Lilith Fair, just as she was starting Lilith Fair, I believe that one came out.
and yeah, she's doing the tour, and obviously she does still love Nova Scotia. She's included Eastern Canada on her tour, um,
Yeah.
but she isn't coming to PEI. We'll talk about that off the air. But I mean, she's going to Moncton, she's going to Halifax. I mean, it's great that yeah, she hasn't forgotten about her East Coast roots.
Yeah, very much so. And like I said, all the research I did, I never saw her, not talk about the Maritimes. Even during, I think it was during COVID, she had an interview with Lyle Lovett. Lyle Lovett was doing a series of interviews with other musicians, and they just talk and play music and jam, and they were great little interviews. Um, and it was Lyle and Sarah McLachlan. And she talked about growing up in Halifax and that she was able to take advantage of the Maritime Conservatory of Music, and she talked about surfing here, and stuff. So yeah, as recently as the last couple of years in interviews, she's just randomly talking about Halifax.
And I didn't realize some of Anne Murray's connections to Prince Edward Island as well.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
she was a teacher here in Somerset.
that's
Um,
right. Yeah.
I know one of her cars is in the Car Life Museum in Bonshaw.
Oh, is it really? Oh, I
Yeah,
didn't know that. Oh, that's great.
yeah,
And of course, her big Anne's breakthrough was Snowbird, written by Gene McClellan, a guy from
yeah.
PEI, and they had a really close relationship. I think she recorded about 8 of his songs. So yeah, and the she used to when she got on Sing Along Jubilee, after she taught for a year, and then she went on Sing Along Jubilee. But the cast of Sing Along would travel around the Maritimes and do shows, and so she was in PEI doing a show, and Bill Langstroth, who was the producer of the TV show, and a married man and 14 years older than her
Right.
at the time. But they were crossing the street somewhere in, I think it was in Charlottetown. It was on PEI for sure. And he reached out and grabbed her hand, and she realized that there was a spark between them. And they speaking of spark, they smoked a joint and kissed that night. She says they kissed, and they began a 7 year affair with him. But that started in PEI, so I'm sure that PEI would have held a lot of significance because of that as well.
I haven't read all of the Anne Murray chapter yet, but I know also that Johnny Reed's bar in Charlottetown, which is very instrumental in a lot of East Coast artists start. Stomp and
Yeah.
Tom, John Allen Cameron, and played there quite a bit back in her day too.
She did. It's funny. I talked to Anne about it back actually when I wrote the Stomp and Tom book. I already knew Anne a little bit, so she agreed to let me interview her for that. And we talked about the Johnny Reed's bar, and she talked about being there, and she knew Lena, Tom's wife, as
Okay.
she was a waitress there at the time and stuff. So yeah, but Anne had fond memories of Johnny Reed and that bar, and seeing have Stomp and Tom was around and stuff like that. And
No,
I think
that's
she's
yeah,
yeah, I think she said her brother Bruce played there,
yeah,
and yeah, she was telling me a lot of the John Allen Cameron. Is it John Allen Cameron?
yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
He played a lot there as well.
yeah,
But it was instrumental in helping a lot of maritime artists get
yeah.
their start and stuff like that. I thought I remember seeing something about an event at the Anne Murray Center last year where Catherine McLachlan came down, Jean's daughter.
Yeah, I don't think she came to the center, but it was again, it was during COVID and we were looking for interesting things to do. And it was the 50th anniversary of Snowbird. And I had
Okay.
reached out to her and we did an online interview, which is still available on YouTube, I believe. But I think by the time we did the interview, it was the 51st anniversary of Snowbird.
Oh, okay.
But we talked about, the connection between Jean and Anne. And she did a few of her father's songs. And oh, she did. You're right, though. I brought her to town. That's right. In 2017 the 150th anniversary of Canada's 150th, we did something called the Maritime Music Fest, and Catherine was just starting to do a show with her dad's music at that time, and she performed live in Spring Hill. You're right. Yeah,
Yeah, that's great. I mean, she's done albums of like her dad's material.
yeah,
And I'm still amazed at how fond his music is to a lot of people here because I've seen so many cover acts and bands in bars and theaters here. They always
yeah.
do a Gene McClellan cover.
Oh, well, I love his music. I was interviewed on CBC radio out of Halifax here just a couple of weeks ago. And the young woman who interviewed me, she's just fresh out of university, so she'd be in her early 20s. And she wanted to know if I could recommend some songs that they could play when they did the interview. And she said, "So what about for Anne Murray?" And I said, "Well, her best known ones are probably You Needed Me, Snowbird, Could I Have This Dance?" I said, "But one of my favorite songs is Bidin' My Time by Gene McClellan." And
Right.
this young woman who's in her early 20s was like, "Oh my God, I love that. Yes, that's the one we're going to play. I love Bidin' My Time." Like she knew it right away. And so it's surprising to me how well known his stuff is still to this day, and even with younger people.
Um, One thing I would have wanted to ask Anne, I don't know if you did. Did you see her Family Guy appearance by any chance?
I did actually, and it's the only episode of Family Guy I ever watched. Yeah, and it was because it was Anne Murray, and I'm a huge Anne Murray fan. So, but yeah, I don't know if I talked to her. I Every year at the Anne Murray Center as a fundraiser for the center, she does this luncheon where people pay like $200 to $250 to come and have lunch with Anne, and they travel from around the world. They come from the UK and
Yeah.
Thailand and New Zealand. And they will ask questions. And I do think people asked her about it. And I think she just said that it was fun to do or something like that. But yeah, because she did have aspirations to be an actor once upon a time, many, many years ago.
She actually did her own voice on that episode.
Yeah, she did it. Yeah,
I was
which is
I
very
still
cool.
find it incredibly funny how Stewie and Brian were so upset that she didn't write her own song.
Well, do you know? Okay, that's something I always I talk about a lot because I've had people say to me, "Oh, Anne Murray didn't even write her own music," and she's talked about that she doesn't get the same respect as say a Joni Mitchell or something.
Right.
But the thing is, it's only because Anne's career happened when it did because it happened in the late '60s. It was the era of the singer-songwriter. So you had Neil Young and Gordon Lightfoot and
Right.
Joni Mitchell and Bob Dylan and all those people writing their own stuff. But Anne was just a vocalist. She never wanted to be a songwriter. And it's like Elvis didn't write his own material. Frank
No, he
Sinatra
didn't.
didn't.
Yeah.
Judy Garland didn't. And nobody goes, oh, Frank Sinatra didn't even write his own songs. It was enough that he was a singer. And that's more the style that Anne was. So she's born a little after her time, I think, really.
And you could also get into the fact that half of the artists in the 60s didn't even play on their own records.
Oh, is that right? Oh, I didn't realize that.
If you've ever heard the story of the Wrecking Crew, the
Yeah.
group of
Oh,
musicians
yes.
back in the
Yeah.
60s, which included Glenn Campbell,
Yeah. Yeah.
played on half the Beach Boys records
Yeah.
and pretty much every hit in the
Yeah.
60s that came out.
I watched a Beach Boys documentary just recently, and they talked about the Wrecking Crew. Yeah.
Yeah, like there's a documentary about the Wrecking Crew, which I find fascinating. It's just amazing to see how many hits they played on. Like it was
Yeah.
this group of musicians that played on pretty much every hit record that came out
It's
in the
incredible.
60s. It is
Yeah.
incredible. But I mean, so I can't fault anyone for singing other people's songs. It happens all the time. That's how Nashville works half of it, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, yeah, and it's like, and a lot of times too, I think like a lot of these younger artists, you'll see, I show my age when I say that these younger artists, but it's like you'll see this as the song credits, and it's like there's 8 songwriters, and they happen to be one of them, and it's like, did they just throw in a line? Did they do a riff? How much did they actually write the song? And that's not always the case, but sometimes it's like so many people have their hands in the pot.
Yeah, for sure. So what are your plans with the book now that it's out? Like I know you've had some health issues, but you look great.
Oh,
But
thank you.
how are you feeling these days? Are you feeling better? Like
Yeah,
you?
I'm great. I feel really good. I was diagnosed with lymphoma, which is a form of cancer, about a year ago, and I had some chemo, and it reduced the cancer a lot. But then I had something called CAR T cell therapy, which is this new therapy, and I've been feeling great since then. I had a PET scan this week, and we'll find out soon if we got all the cancer. So fingers crossed, the cancer's gone. To put it in a nutshell, like in a minute. So actually, as I was finishing up the book, I was also dealing with a lot of cancer and health issues. So between COVID and cancer, that may also be why the book took a little longer. But when the Rita MacNeil book came out, I did a couple readings, and then I was like, this is a book about music. I wish I had music. And my partner she's a music teacher, but she's also a singer and she
Right.
plays instruments. So started doing readings where I would get Heather to come with me. And so I would tell that story about Working Man that I mentioned to you a minute ago, and then Heather would sing the song. So people would get
Okay.
the feel of get to hear, get I'd set up the song that Rita wrote, and then people would actually get to hear it. So we did a couple readings like that, and I thought this could be a show. Maybe we could do a whole show. So I created a tribute show with Teresa Melanfon, blues singer from New Brunswick, who's amazing. And Rita wrote a fair number of gospel and blues songs, and I had heard those over the years and thought I'd love to hear Teresa Melanfon do these. So I did. I put Teresa in the cast. She sang those, and we traveled around, and I read from the book and told stories about working with Rita, and I had a 4-piece female band, and they played
Right.
all the instruments and did her songs. And then I did the same just this past year. The Anne Murray Center, the 35th anniversary was
Right.
coming up, and I said, "Well, I've got all this research about Anne Murray in a book. Why don't we do a tribute show to Anne Murray?" So I created a tribute show that was inspired in part by my research, and so I read bits from the book and told stories about working with Anne, and we did that. But now I'm thinking, maybe I could do a tribute show with, music from all 6 of these. I could talk about each of them. It wouldn't be quite the same journey that you get with a whole evening about just Rita or a whole evening about Anne, but I could cover all 6 of these women and have music from all of them. So I
Right.
am thinking that could possibly happen. Um, but right now, I'm looking at doing some stuff online, like I did with Stomp and Tom. Maybe my partner Heather and I during COVID, we had a show called the Charlie and Heather Show, where
Right.
I told stories and she sang songs. But I think we might do a 6-part series on the book for that as well. So yeah.
But what about nothing like a traditional book tour? Like
We haven't planned anything yet. I'm hoping to do some launches locally, and
right.
I'm in Amherst and Spring Hill. There's been interest from Amherst and Spring Hill, and I may go to Sackville,
Right.
New Brunswick. But yeah, we haven't. Nothing's been set up in terms of a traditional book tour yet.
And yeah, we had mentioned before I started recording, you're actually going to go see Sarah in Moncton.
Yeah, I am. I'm really excited about that. As I said, I tried to get a hold of her and couldn't. So I'm hoping I can get a book and set it up on the front of the stage.
Yeah.
Get a book tour. Maybe she'll get to know it exists at least.
Well, I've interviewed her guitar player, Luke Doucette, who is an amazing artist in his own right with his wife,
Oh, okay.
Melissa McLachlan. They have a band called White Horse. They're absolutely
Oh,
incredible. But
yeah.
yeah, he's toured with Sarah since. Fumbling Towards Ecstasy.
Uh,
He was actually talking about how they played the Budweiser stage, formerly the
oh,
Molson
okay.
Amphitheater. And I asked him if he ever played the Ontario Police Forum, which is what it was before the Molson Amphitheater. And he said, yeah, I played with Sarah on the Fumbling Towards Ecstasy tour, the
Oh,
original
wow.
tour at the, and I thought that was a really cool story to
Did
hear
did
that.
did he give you any juicy tidbits about Sarah that I could have used in the book?
I He probably could have, but I'm not that kind of interviewer,
Yeah.
as you know. I try to keep it pleasant. I don't want to step on toes and say
Yeah.
bad things about anybody. I'm sure
Well,
there's
yeah, and I'm the same. My books. I'm not. Kitty Kelly is a famous biographer who writes, all the horrible things about people. And mine, I try to make it more a celebration of these people. And sometimes I even hear stories. I'm like, yeah, that doesn't need to be in the book. I know some. When we turn this off, I can tell you some stuff about Stomp and Tom that'll turn your ears red.
I think that's what every band member I've ever interviewed and Tom's has said the same thing. And I don't want to hear dirt on them.
Yeah,
I don't want
I
to hear.
know.
I'm sure they've all got dirt on them,
Yeah,
and they've told me some things that I probably shouldn't have heard, but I'm not getting that out
yeah.
to the
No, I
public.
know. I don't share that stuff. And even sometimes people will tell me a story and yeah, I find it interesting, but I'm like, I can't use that unless it's been verified by a bunch of people. One of the stories about Rita MacNeil that I did not include in my book, and I don't think it's mentioned in this either. This I had to start from scratch when I wrote the chapter for this book about Rita. At first, I thought, oh, I can
Right.
just take my book and
Yeah.
cut and paste, and it's not
Yeah.
how it works. I had to start from scratch again. But
Yeah.
when I was writing that book, I put out on Facebook and I said, if any of you know Rita MacNeil, if you have any pictures or stories or anything, please feel free to share. So a friend of mine who works in Toronto wrote to me and said, I have it on good authority that Rita MacNeil stole Mr. Dressup's tickle trunk. And I was like, that can't be true. And he's like, no, I know a guy who worked at CBC. He claims he put the tickle trunk in Rita MacNeil's van and she drove away with it. And so I was like, that's not true. So I asked a couple people. I interviewed Joella Folds, who knew Rita, and she said, oh, and I'd never heard about that. And then I asked Rita's son, Wade, and he acted like he didn't know anything about it. And then I connected with Noreen Basker, and she was Rita's partner for like 20 years. And they lived together for some of that, but she was also Rita's assistant, and she was on the road with her and stuff. And I said to Noreen, I met her in Halifax, and she was giving me some pictures for the book. And I said, yeah, some of the stories I heard were crazy. Like somebody told me Rita stole Mr. Dressup's tickle trunk. And Noreen said, Rita didn't steal the tickle trunk. I stole the tickle trunk. And I was like, what? She'd been in the warehouse at the CBC. She went in and she saw Jerome the giraffe from the Friendly Giant with a broken neck, and there was other stuff all beat up, and there was a tickle trunk sitting there. And she said to one of the warehouse men, "What's going to happen to that tickle trunk?" He said, "It's probably going to get beat up like everything else around here." And she said, "Well, then I'm taking it." And she came back the next day with a van. She got them to load it in the van, and Rita was like, Rita had no idea, so Rita's totally oblivious to this. They were going on tour. Noreen sends it home to Cape Breton. They get home to Cape Breton, and Rita's like, "What is this?" And Noreen says, "It's Mr. Dressup's tickle trunk. I saved it." And it was in
Amazing.
Rita's upstairs hallway for years and years. Noreen still has it. She met Mr. Dressup's Ernie Coombs. She met his manager at one point and said, I have one of the tickle trunks from CBC if you ever want it. He said, well, we've got one that we use on the road. They've got one there. If we want it, I'll let you know.
That's amazing. That's a great story. With the
Just,
clarity to it. Oh, that's awesome.
yeah,
That would there's
anyway,
only
just
so much you can put in the book, right? So
well, exactly. So I was like, I can't do that. I can't put that in the book. But then later, Noreen told me it was okay. So I did put it on Facebook, and then it got picked up by a newspaper. And so the story's out there somewhere now, but it's not in my book. So.
so we have to do another edition and add some stuff, you think maybe?
Well, I could. You know what's interesting too is, and I noticed this especially with the Stomp and Tom book. People don't want to talk to me when I'm writing the book, and then once it's done,
They want
everybody's coming out of the woodwork with all
yeah,
their stories, and
yeah,
it's like I could not get anybody close to Holly or Sarah to really open up. Like some people who knew them a little bit, but it was hard to find people who would open up and share more intimate stories. It's amazing, and maybe it's a Nova Scotia thing or a maritime thing, but these people, no matter how famous they are, the people around them are very protective of them. Like
yeah,
nobody wants to give away too much. They're
right,
so it can be hard sometimes to get. And again, I'm not even looking for dirt. I just want to know these people.
right. Great stuff. I wish you nothing but the best of luck with the book. I'm enjoying reading it so far. I haven't finished reading. I'm sorry about that, but
Oh no.
and I don't want to mainly because I don't want to give away too much now. I want, people should go out and buy it and read it. It's a great read so far. And it's a great topic too. Like it's, like you said, it just happens to be six Nova Scotia artists that did break ground in their time. You know,
And I just like I'm fans of these women,
yeah,
pretty much all of them. So I just feel lucky that I got to spend time in their world and research their stories and stuff like that. And yeah,
for sure. Anyway, like I said, best of luck.
thank you
Everybody
so
go out and
much.
buy it. I appreciate you taking the time to do this. I know we've been talking about doing this, but we've been waiting for the right time, and this is the right time. So
The book's out in stores now, so it's a great time to do it. So
awesome.
thank you
All right.
so much. It was great chatting with you.
Thanks a lot. Take care, sir.
You too. Bye.